It is time on this Friday, and soon to be the beginning of the weekend, it's time to also overreact about Mythic Plus. Because yesterday we were overreacting about the first results of the raid, so now we are going to go and take a look at some of the results, some of the data that we have available about Mythic Plus, to have some overreactions here as well. Now, Mythic Plus is slightly more different than the raid, in the sense that in the raid we were checking the heroic performances, meaning that everyone could get into heroic, everyone could test multiple bosses, so we got to see the results of most of the specs in heroic, whereas for Mythic Plus, of course, it's going to be slightly different, because as we keep going higher and higher in Mythic Plus keys, fewer and fewer specs will make the cut. Over time, we will start losing some more specs down the road and only see finally which are the specs that are remaining at the very top. So for now, in Mythic Plus, the situation is of course much different, since many specs can compete right now in keys like 17, 18, 19, you know, the few 20s. But then as you start going higher, we will start seeing a more competitive set of specs. Let's start, before even looking at the performances, before even looking at, you know, how are the best of the groups being formed, by looking at the popularity of the specs, because that can also give you an idea. You know, do we really think in the later keys specs like, for example, Affliction or Marksmanship or Destruction are going to be the pick to go, given how lowly played they are, for example? That is going to be quite unlikely. Now, in our Mythic Plus prediction of a few days ago, we mentioned certain specs being towards the bottom, although for different reasons. We had specs like Destruction, specs like Shadow Priest, specs like Windwalker, specs like Devastation, like Unholy, like Frost, and like Elemental. Now, these specs are pretty much all here, basically, towards the bottom, although it was for different reasons. For example, for both of the DK specs, it was due to not being particularly strong, but for specs like Devastation they are not actually that bad, it's just that they have to deal with this over here. You know, Marksmanship has been buffed, it's not even that terrible anymore, but they have to deal with this thing right here. These were some of the differences of the popularity of certain specs. Now, we can also divide them, of course, by role, starting with the tanks, and the lowest down of the tanks right now are Brewmaster and Protection, although they are pretty close, pretty tied together between Guardian, Protection and Brewmaster. They are quite even in terms of popularity. Higher up, you have Protection, and then Blood, and then Vengeance. This is also something we were thinking about when we were talking about the popularity of the specs coming this season. We mentioned how at any given point in the season, Blood is also very popular, but how we thought Vengeance was going to be the S tier tank, how Prot Paladin remains a popular spec amongst players, and how the nerfed Guardian Druid wasn't likely going to be the same, of course, as Season 2. So far, still following what we thought about the predictions for the season. When it comes to healers, we thought, okay, the first in line is gonna be Discipline, of course, and for now it is respecting the results, it is respecting the predictions. The other one that we thought was going to remain popular was going to be Holy Paladin, which is also confirming our predictions. For the other ones, we are more or less right. Towards the bottom in popularity, we had Preservation Evoker, Resto Shaman, and Holy Priest, which are right over here. Holy Priest, Preservation, and Resto Shaman. So, at the very least, from the early keys, they are respecting most of the predictions, although, of course, we will have to see how things become later down the line, when things get more serious. Because some things might change between the popularity of certain specs and the performance. For example, there are specs that will remain popular and played by many players, even if they're not that meta. We have seen this before. For example, we saw this with Beast Mastery, even when Beast Mastery was not meta, or even when Hunter in general isn't meta, the strongest of the Hunter pick, which is usually BM or Marksmanship, they still remain very popular. We saw this with Ret. Ret, after the rework, has been very popular. They have not exactly been meta at all times or ever, but they have remained a very highly picked spec. Same goes for Balance Druid, it's another one of the popular picks, and for Protection Paladin. Now, what are some of the outliers? We have mentioned we were right in most of the predictions, in most of what we expected, but maybe there are some things that we didn't expect. For example, what is Demo doing here? The simple answer could be, well, Warlock is still a popular class. As soon as Mythic Plus comes out, there are gonna be a lot of Warlocks in Mythic Plus, and because Demo, as we mentioned, this one we were certain of, because Demo was clearly the stronger one of the other two options of Warlock, it was going to be a reasonably played spec. Another thing we were talking about was the difference in mages. We mentioned how, in terms of performance, Fire was the better one together with Arcane, and Frost lagging behind. However, right now, Arcane is very low down. To be fair, to my defense, I said to many players of the community, to many average players, Arcane was going to be falling down right here because of the difficulty in executing Arcane properly. At the start of the season, when you have no idea, many players have no idea about the mechanics of the trash, the mechanics of the bosses, they're just YOLOing every pack and every pool, it's gonna be much harder to perform on a more complex spec like Arcane. So at least for now, it makes more sense. It's much easier to pilot a spec like Frost, for example, early on in the dungeons. We will see in a few weeks when you start to do 25s if it's gonna be the same thing when it comes to mages. But also let's look at some other things, like checking out, for example, the average DPS results by looking at the logs, by looking at the available logs of completed Mythic Plus keys and see how the specs are performing. That might also give us another idea of how specs stand. Because, for example, while we are seeing a spec like Arms not particularly up the popularity, so you wouldn't think of them being particularly strong, when you look, for example, at the average DPS, when Arms is sitting at 117,000 DPS, you realize it's amongst the highest. They are only beaten by BM, Havoc, Outlaw, and Demonology, which we also here doing relatively well, all of them, BM, Havoc, and then lower down, Outlaw, and Demo. And then Arms. So this can already tell you one thing, for example, that Arms DPS is pumping compared to most others. For example, some of these results of DPS are not particularly surprising. We know that after the buffs, for example, Assassination, the DPS in AoE of Assassination was significantly increased. This type of DPS is not what we are used to seeing Assassination in when it comes to Mythic Plus. Now they have been clearly improved in what they can do in AoE groups, in AoE packs, in Mythic Plus keys. Even though, yes, as we also mentioned when we were making our predictions, they were still going to be suffering from the Outlaw being stronger in terms of damage, taking away some of the players from Assassination, where we see Outlaw being, of course, higher up in terms of play rate compared to Assassination, and even more also what we said compared to Subtlety, which simply had the misfortune of being slightly weaker than both Assassination and Outlaw. So that's also somewhat expected when it comes to Rogues, and of course the most expected was when it came to Warlocks. We have Demo far above both of the other two Warlock specs. Now, much like we said, of course, the disclaimer is that much like we said for DPS in the raid, even in Mythic Plus, many of these specs are going to be performing without a tier set. And much like in the raid, some of these tier sets do not matter that much. You know, Frost is not doing too well. You're like, well, maybe Frost is going to be bailed out by the powerful tier set. Well, no, because the powerful tier set is just a 3% damage increase. Unholies, it's barely a 1%. You have a DPS loss even for Destro. You know how good it feels knowing that you're about to become 3% weaker than this for Destro. Others do have some more significant increases, you know, over 6% for Feral, 9% for Marksmanship Hunter, you have 7+% for Arcane Mage, and of course 14%, the biggest one, for Elemental Shaman. So still, some of these results might be bound to change once specs get completed in their powers. They recraft the embellishments, they get their crafted items, they get their tier sets, and then they can start pumping as God intended in this season. So this is again one of the preliminary early looks for the specs. We looked at the DPS, same goes for tanks. Now for tanks, it's also quite interesting because of the damage they can do. We are not surprised to be seeing Brewmaster as the top damage, and also we are not surprised in seeing Vengeance very high up in damage. Also not surprised to see in Protection Paladin being nerfed over time to being the least amount of damage when it comes to tanks. So at the very least, as far as damage is concerned, this is not particularly surprising. Also, based on the results of the keys, it's also not surprising to see Vengeance Demon Hunter being the most overall popular of the specs, followed by Blood Death Knight. This is also following more or less what we were expecting of tanks in the early entry-level Mythic Plus keys. What about the healers? Also important to keep track of the damage of the healers. Now, damage-wise, Discipline Priest and Mistweaver Monk are the two ones above the rest. That's also what we were expecting. They are both roughly 10% above most of the other specs, even 15 and 20% for the lower down specs. What is also not surprising are some of the damage weaknesses of some of the other specs. Perhaps the more surprising one is Resto Druid, because we did mention the feral, the cat damage buffs, the significant cat damage buffs being given last minute to Resto. And this cat damage buff should be higher than this, should bring Resto Druid to have a better damage than this one. But perhaps, as we mentioned also, it wasn't going to be that easy to pull off this kind of cat damage, to pull off this cat weave in Mythic Plus keys, especially in the first few days of Mythic Plus, especially when you don't even know how dangerous certain abilities are, certain trash mobs are, or certain bosses are, so you are much less confident as a Resto Druid to be able to pull off this type of damage. You're mostly just concerned with trying to keep everyone alive. It is also likely that as we go deeper into Mythic Plus, the damage of Resto Druid will increase more than the damage increase of the other healers, because for example Discipline is likely more or less going to continue to do the same damage as they use that for healing, for example, whereas Resto Druid perhaps can increase more than average when it comes to healers. It is always interesting to see these type of arbitrary rankings that most sites and most compilations of data are going to choose depending on what they think like it's more valuable. In here, for example, we see Augmentation, Beast Mastery, and Havoc. We switch over to Sub Creation and we still have Augmentation and Havoc. We also have BM right over here, but then we have Assassination over Outlaw. In here instead we have Outlaw above Assassination, even in terms of damage results. We still have Demo quite high up over here, but we have Ret lower down, bogged with the rest of the melee DPS, whereas in here Ret is one of the high performers. What few data points seem to be all in agreement are with specs like Marksmanship, like Destro, like Affliction, Elemental, even Subtlety and Survival are all being put basically together towards the bottom, unanimously. That seems to have put everyone to agree in terms of the results so far. However, these are the masses. This is taking all of the logs in Mythic Plus, this is taking all of the logs and putting them into data points like the damage scores in Mythic Plus keys, the level of the keys being completed, etc, etc. But what if you look at the top results? Now obviously these are not, very relevant right now. Many players are even busy raiding more so than doing Mythic Plus, or farming 17s or 18s or 19s for gear more so than trying to wipe on a 23 right now. So it's not still very relevant, but we might start to see some ideas of what certain high level of players are going to go for in this season. We do see, for example, way more balance across tanks. We have just seen, oh yeah, Vengeance. Vengeance is the highest, Vengeance is the highest, Vengeance is the most popular of the tanks, easy. But in here, it's actually quite even. there is a good amount of vengeance. It's pretty much tied with blood and even tied with protection warrior, for example. Same goes for healers, actually. We have been told, okay, discipline, okay, discipline, okay, discipline. Across the board, most popular, performing the best, etc, etc. Then you look at the highest results of healers, and discipline is not dominating nearly as much as you thought it would, for example. We can also say the same about the DPS. The only one that unfortunately seems to be respecting this type of ranking is Augmentation, who was thought to be in the S tier in terms of performance and in terms of popularity. When you look at the highest keys, there is basically in almost every key there is an Augmentation evoker. I don't even have to hover over the spec to know it's not going to be Devastation, but it's going to be exclusively an Augmentation evoker. The other spec that you see the most is going to be Havoc so far. So it's going to be both Havoc and Augmentation. The third one is way more open to interpretation. You see Druid, you see Assassination Rogue and Outlaw Rogue. You see even a Fury Warrior, even a random Unholy Death Knight across all of the other picks. Even a Red Paladin shows up. So for now, of course, it's much more volatile. It's much more up for most players to try to get into. We will see once we start growing, 2, 3, even 4 more key levels in the next few weeks, how many of these specs will keep up with that type of key compared to where we are right now in terms of the results in Mythic Plus. But this was, this was the average first take after the first 3.5 days of Mythic Plus, where pretty much everyone just jumps in to try to farm for gear. So not even with climbing, not even with doing high keys as the goal in mind. This gave us an idea of what the players are playing, the specs that they have chosen for this season, and the initial performance of these specs. For today, this was the recap when it comes to Mythic Plus, when it comes to the situation in Mythic Plus for the first week of the season. And we will see then, of course, how much this will swing in the following weeks, in the following resets when it comes to Mythic Plus. So, for today, it's time to leave each other on this Friday. Thanks, of course, as usual, to all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. Now, with all of these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I started the video and I forgot I needed to finish my banana. Nicely matured.